The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of Oakwood Children's Home, casting long rectangles of light across the worn hardwood floor. Olivia Chen sat on the windowsill, her small fingers tracing patterns on the foggy glass. Outside, other children played tag in the yard, their laughter rising and falling like wind chimes. But Olivia preferred to watch from a distance, finding comfort in the quiet corner where she could hear the faint notes from the piano room down the hall. At 12 years old, Olivia had spent half her life at Oakwood. She remembered little of her life before, fragmented memories of her mother's hands guiding hers across piano keys, her father's violin filling their small apartment with warm, rich sounds. Sometimes she wasn't sure if these were actual memories or stories she had created to comfort herself on lonely nights. Mrs. Wilson, the home's director, often told Olivia that she had her mother's hands, pianist's hands, she called them. Long fingers that could stretch across octaves despite her small size. The old photograph Olivia kept under her pillow confirmed this. It showed her mother seated at a grand piano, her slender hands poised mid-performance, her face alive with joy. The photograph and a tarnished locket were all Olivia had left after the car accident that took both her parents when she was 6. Neither item could tell her what her mother's voice sounded like when she sang lullabies or how her father smelled of rosin and coffee. Those details had faded with time like watercolors left in the sun. "Olivia, there you are." Mrs. Wilson's voice pulled her from her thoughts. The older woman stood in the doorway, smoothing down her always neat gray skirt. "Please come help prepare the main hall. We have an important visitor coming today." Olivia slid off the windowsill and followed Mrs. Wilson down the corridor. The director walked with quick, nervous steps, something unusual for the normally composed woman. "Who's coming?" Olivia asked, hurrying to keep pace. "Mr. Richard Harrington," Mrs. Wilson replied, her voice slightly higher than normal. When Olivia showed no recognition, she added, "The tech billionaire? Harrington Technologies. His foundation donates to children's causes." Olivia nodded politely, though the name meant nothing to her. Wealthy people occasionally visited Oakwood, took photos for their charity newsletters, and left feeling good about themselves. They rarely returned. The main hall was already buzzing with activity when they arrived. Several staff members arranged chairs while others instructed the younger children on proper behavior. Olivia was directed to dust the ancient upright piano that sat in the corner, largely ignored except during Christmas when one of the teachers played carols. As she wiped the wooden surface, Olivia couldn't resist pressing one of the keys. The note rang out, slightly out of tune but still clear. She quickly pulled her hand back, glancing around to see if anyone had noticed. "Go ahead," said Grace, one of the kitchen staff who was arranging cookies on a tray nearby. "That thing could use some attention." "When was the last time you played?" Olivia shrugged. "Last week, when everyone was at the park." She didn't add that she played whenever she could find a moment alone, that she practiced in her mind when she couldn't touch a real piano, or that she sometimes dreamed of performing in concert halls like her parents once did. Grace smiled knowingly. "Well, maybe you can play something for our visitor. Show him what our kids can do." Olivia shook her head quickly. "I'm not that good," she whispered, though her heart quickened at the thought of playing for someone other than herself. An hour later, the main hall was transformed as much as the limited resources of Oakwood allowed. The worn furniture had been arranged to hide the most noticeable stains. Fresh wildflowers from the garden brightened the tables, and the children were dressed in their cleanest clothes. The unmistakable crunch of tires on gravel announced the arrival of their visitor. Mrs. Wilson rushed to the entrance, gesturing for the children to line up. Olivia took her place at the end of the line, partially hidden behind Theo, a tall boy who had arrived at Oakwood just a few months ago. Richard Harrington was not what Olivia expected. From Mrs. Wilson's nervous energy, she had imagined someone intimidating. Instead, the man who walked through the door was surprisingly ordinary-looking, despite his expensive clothes. He was tall with salt and pepper hair and laugh lines around his eyes. He moved with the easy confidence of someone used to being in charge but smiled warmly as he shook Mrs. Wilson's hand. "Thank you for having me today." His voice carried across the room. "I've heard wonderful things about Oakwood." Mrs. Wilson beamed. "We're honored by your interest in our home, Mr. Harrington. Please, let me introduce you to some of our children." As the director led their visitor down the line of children, each one stepped forward to shake his hand and say their name. Some of the younger ones giggled nervously while the teenagers tried to appear nonchalant. Olivia watched carefully, noting how Mr. Harrington bent slightly to look each child in the eye when they spoke, giving them his full attention. When he reached Olivia, she stepped forward and extended her hand as she had been taught. "I'm Olivia Chen," she said quietly. Mr. Harrington shook her hand. "Nice to meet you, Olivia. That's a beautiful name. Does it have a special meaning?" Before she could answer, Mrs. Wilson jumped in. "Olivia came to us 6 years ago. Both her parents were musicians, quite talented from what I understand." "Really?" Mr. Harrington looked genuinely interested. "What instruments did they play?" "My mother was a pianist," Olivia said, finding her voice. "My father played violin with the City Symphony." Something flickered in Mr. Harrington's eyes. Recognition, perhaps, or curiosity. "Do you play as well?" Olivia hesitated. "Sometimes," she admitted. "When I can." Mrs. Wilson continued the tour, showing Mr. Harrington the dining area, the small library, and the garden where they grew some of their own vegetables. Throughout the tour, Olivia noticed that the billionaire asked thoughtful questions about the children's education, healthcare, and activities. He wasn't just going through the motions like some visitors. When they returned to the main hall for refreshments, Mr. Harrington paused by the piano. He ran his fingers lightly over the top, leaving trails in the dust Olivia had missed. "This has seen better days," he remarked. Mrs. Wilson sighed. "Yes, it was donated 15 years ago. We don't have the budget for music lessons, I'm afraid, though some of the children teach themselves." Mr. Harrington pressed a key, wincing at the slightly off note. "Music education is so important for development. My foundation has been looking into programs." He stopped mid-sentence, his attention caught by something across the room. Olivia followed his gaze and realized he was looking at her. She had unconsciously moved closer to the piano, drawn to it like always. "You said you play sometimes?" Mr. Harrington asked her directly. Put on the spot, Olivia could only nod. A smile spread across the billionaire's face. He turned to Mrs. Wilson with sudden enthusiasm. "You know what? If she plays the piano, I'll adopt her." He laughed loudly, the sound echoing in the high-ceilinged room. The staff exchanged uncomfortable glances. Mrs. Wilson forced a polite chuckle. "Mr. Harrington, adoption is quite a serious process." Of course, he waved his hand dismissively. "I'm just saying I appreciate artistic talent. My sister was a pianist, never got to pursue it professionally, though." For a moment, something sad crossed his face before the confident smile returned. Olivia stood frozen, unsure how to respond to being the subject of such a strange comment. She knew he wasn't serious. Wealthy people didn't just adopt children on a whim, not even billionaires. Still, the casual way he spoke about something so life-changing made her stomach twist. An awkward silence fell over the room. Finally, Mrs. Wilson cleared her throat. "Perhaps Olivia would play something for us. If she feels comfortable, of course." All eyes turned to Olivia. Her heart hammered in her chest. She hadn't played for an audience since the school talent show last year, and that had been a simple piece. But something about Mr. Harrington's careless remark stirred a defiance in her. She wanted to show him that she wasn't just some charity case to joke about. Slowly, Olivia nodded and walked to the piano. She sat on the bench, adjusted its height, and placed her hands on the keys. The familiar touch of ivory under her fingertips calmed her racing heart. She closed her eyes for a moment, hearing her mother's voice from long ago. "Music speaks when words fail us. Live, let it speak for you," behind her. She could hear Mr. Harrington settling into a chair, probably expecting a simple rendition of Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, or some other beginner's piece. Olivia took a deep breath and began to play. The first notes of Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major filled the room, flowing from her fingers as naturally as breathing. She had practiced this piece countless times in stolen moments, first picking out the melody by ear and later correcting herself when she found the sheet music in a book from the library. It was her mother's favorite. As she played, Olivia forgot about Mr. Harrington and his thoughtless remark. She forgot about the worn clothes she wore and the uncertain future she faced. In that moment, she was her mother's daughter, speaking through music when words failed her. The slightly out-of-tune piano transformed under her touch, its imperfections becoming part of the story she told through Chopin's notes, a story of loss, longing, and quiet hope. In the corner of the room, Richard Harrington's smile had vanished. He sat perfectly still, his eyes fixed on the small girl at the piano whose talent had just silenced his laughter. The last notes of Chopin's Nocturne hung in the air like morning mist. For several heartbeats, no one in Oakwood's main hall moved or spoke. The silence that followed Olivia's performance wasn't empty. It was filled with unspoken emotions, with surprise and wonder and something else that felt almost like reverence. Olivia's hands remained poised over the keys, trembling slightly. She hadn't played the entire piece perfectly. The middle section had a few stumbles where her fingers couldn't quite reach across the octaves, and the old piano's uneven action had caused some notes to ring louder than she intended. But none of that mattered. She had played with her heart, and everyone in the room had felt it. When she finally looked up, she saw Mrs. Wilson dabbing at her eyes with the corner of her cardigan. Grace from the kitchen stood with her hand pressed to her mouth, cookie tray forgotten at her side. The other children stared at Olivia as if seeing her for the first time, despite having lived alongside her for years. And then there was Mr. Harrington. The billionaire sat completely still, his earlier joviality gone. His face had paled slightly, and he gripped the armrests of his chair so tightly that his knuckles had turned white. When his eyes met Olivia's, she couldn't read his expression. It seemed to contain too many emotions at once. Mrs. Wilson broke the silence, her voice unusually soft. "Well, that was extraordinary, Olivia. I had no idea you could play like that." Olivia ducked her head, suddenly self-conscious. "Thank you," she whispered. "Where did you learn that piece?" Mr. Harrington asked. His voice sounded different now, hoarser, less polished. "My mother taught me the beginning," Olivia explained, running her fingers lightly over the keys without pressing them down. "Before she died, I learned the rest on my own." "On your own," he repeated, as if testing the weight of these words. Mrs. Wilson stepped forward, clearly trying to regain control of the situation. "Olivia has always shown a natural aptitude for music. If we had the resources for proper lessons—" "My sister played that same nocturne," Mr. Harrington interrupted, still looking at Olivia. "At her last recital before she got sick." Something in his tone made the room grow quiet again. This wasn't the confident businessman speaking now, but someone else, someone with old wounds. He cleared his throat and seemed to shake himself back to the present moment. "That was beautifully played, Olivia. Thank you for sharing your talent with us." An awkward pause followed. The casual joke about adoption now hung in the air like an uninvited guest that no one knew how to politely dismiss. Mr. Harrington himself seemed to realize the inappropriateness of his earlier comment, judging by the faint flush on his cheeks. Mrs. Wilson, ever practical, steered the conversation toward safer waters. "Children, why don't you show Mr. Harrington the art projects you've been working on? Theo, could you bring the display boards from the classroom?" As the children scrambled to follow her instructions, Mr. Harrington rose from his chair. He approached the piano with measured steps and stood beside it, not looking at Olivia directly but instead studying the instrument itself. "This piano needs proper maintenance," he said, almost to himself. "The action is uneven and it's at least a quarter tone flat." Olivia nodded, surprised that he could tell. "The F-sharp key sticks sometimes," she offered. "And the pedal squeaks." He smiled faintly. "You've done remarkable things with an imperfect instrument." After a pause, he asked, "Do you play anything else? Besides Chopin?" "Some Bach. And I try to figure out songs I hear on the radio sometimes." She hesitated, then added, "I make up my own music too." When no one's around, this caught his attention. "Original compositions?" Olivia shrugged, suddenly embarrassed. "Just little pieces. Nothing special." "I'd like to hear one someday," he said, and something in his tone suggested he meant it. Before Olivia could respond, Theo returned with the art display, and Mr. Harrington moved away to admire the children's paintings and crafts. For the remainder of his visit, he was the perfect guest, complimenting artwork, asking thoughtful questions about the children's studies, and discussing potential improvements to the facility with Mrs. Wilson. He even joined them for lunch in the dining hall, sitting among the younger children and listening to their stories with apparent interest. Yet Olivia noticed that he seemed distracted. Several times she caught him looking in her direction with a thoughtful expression. Once when their eyes met across the room, he gave her a small nod, as if confirming something to himself. As the afternoon drew to a close, Mr. Harrington prepared to leave. The children lined up to say goodbye, thanking him for visiting as Mrs. Wilson had instructed them to do. When it was Olivia's turn, he shook her hand a bit longer than the others. "It was a pleasure to meet you, Olivia," he said formally, though his eyes conveyed something more complex. "Your parents would be very proud of how you've preserved their gift." The simple words, spoken with such sincerity, brought an unexpected lump to Olivia's throat. She could only nod in response. Mrs. Wilson walked Mr. Harrington to his car, their conversation too quiet for anyone else to hear. Olivia watched from the window as they spoke, noting how the director gestured animatedly while the billionaire mostly listened, nodding occasionally. When the sleek black car finally pulled away from Oakwood, the children erupted into excited chatter. "Did you see his watch? Bet it cost more than this whole building. He said he liked my dragon painting. Do you think he'll send us stuff? Rich people always send stuff after they visit." Theo nudged Olivia with his elbow. "You really surprised him with that piano playing." His face was priceless. Olivia smiled weakly, but her mind was elsewhere. The day's events had left her feeling oddly unsettled. Mr. Harrington's careless joke about adoption, followed by his reaction to her playing, had stirred up feelings she usually kept carefully contained: hope, disappointment, longing for a family, fear of being hurt again. Mrs. Wilson returned, looking flushed and excited. "Children, that went very well. Mr. Harrington was very impressed with all of you." Her eyes found Olivia, especially with our pianist. "Olivia, dear, could I have a word?" Heart suddenly racing, Olivia followed Mrs. Wilson to her small office. The director closed the door and gestured for Olivia to sit in the chair across from her desk. "Mr. Harrington was quite moved by your performance," Mrs. Wilson began, choosing her words carefully. "He mentioned that his foundation has a music program for gifted young people." Olivia sat very still, afraid to hope. "Nothing is certain yet," Mrs. Wilson continued, "but he's going to look into the possibility of including you in the program. It could mean proper lessons, access to better instruments." She trailed off, watching Olivia's face. "Did he?" Olivia swallowed hard. "Did he say anything about his joke? About adoption?" Mrs. Wilson's expression softened. "Oh, Olivia, you mustn't take that seriously. Mr. Harrington is known for making impulsive statements. He meant nothing by it." Olivia nodded quickly. "I know. I just wondered. His foundation does wonderful work supporting children like you, but adoption is an entirely different matter. It involves legal processes, home studies, a genuine commitment to parenting." Mrs. Wilson sighed. "Rich people sometimes don't understand how their words can affect others." I'm sure he's already forgotten about that comment, but Olivia wasn't so sure. She had seen something in Mr. Harrington's eyes when she played. A recognition, a connection. Not that she believed he would actually adopt her. That was a silly fantasy. The kind she might have indulged in when she was 7 or 8, not now at 12. She was old enough to know that billionaires didn't sweep in and rescue orphans like in the movies. Still, as she left Mrs. Wilson's office and headed to the dormitory to change for dinner duty, she couldn't help wondering what it would be like to have a real piano to practice on, to have lessons with a proper teacher, to play music without having to worry about disturbing others or finding rare moments of privacy. That night, after lights out, Olivia lay awake in her narrow bed, listening to the soft breathing of the other girls in the dormitory. She slipped her hand under her pillow and touched the worn photograph of her mother at the piano. "I played your favorite piece today," she whispered in her mind, a habit she'd developed over the years. "I think you would have liked how I did the middle section." Outside, rain began to fall, pattering gently against the windows. Olivia closed her eyes and imagined the raindrops as notes on a piano, creating patterns and rhythms in her mind. She began to compose a new piece in her head, something that captured the strange mixture of emotions she'd felt today. The hope and the doubt, the pride in her playing and the lingering ache of loss. She didn't know that 20 miles away, in a luxurious penthouse overlooking the city lights, Richard Harrington also lay awake listening to the same rain. On his tablet, he scrolled through old photographs of a teenage girl seated at a grand piano, her face alight with joy, her future seemingly boundless before illness stole it away. And he wondered if perhaps his thoughtless joke had been something else entirely, a moment of recognition, an unexpected chance to make something right. A week passed with no word from Richard Harrington, then another. By the third week, the excitement of his visit had faded at Oakwood. replaced by the usual routines of school, chores, and occasional weekend activities. Only Mrs. Wilson still mentioned him sometimes, reminding the staff that these things take time and wealthy people are very busy. Olivia tried not to think about it. She'd been disappointed too many times before, by potential adoptive parents who chose younger children, by promises of special programs that fell through due to budget cuts, by her own fragile hopes that something might change. Better to expect nothing and be surprised than to hope and be hurt again. Still, she couldn't help noticing that Mrs. Wilson watched her more closely these days, especially when she was at the piano. The director had even arranged Olivia's chore schedule to give her an extra half-hour of piano time each evening. To practice, she said with a meaningful look, though she never specified what Olivia should be practicing for. Life at Oakwood continued its predictable rhythm until one rainy Tuesday afternoon when a delivery truck pulled up to the front entrance. Two men in uniforms unloaded a large object wrapped in thick padding and protective plastic. "Delivery for Oakwood Children's Home," one called as he consulted his clipboard. "Piano tuning service scheduled for tomorrow morning at 9. The news spread through Oakwood like wildfire. By the time the delivery men had placed the mysterious package in the main hall and departed, nearly every child and staff member had gathered to watch as Mrs. Wilson carefully removed the protective coverings. A collective gasp filled the room as the gleaming surface of a baby grand piano was revealed. Not brand new, but beautifully restored, its polished black surface reflecting the overhead lights like a mirror. Mrs. Wilson ran her hand reverently over the lid. "It's from Harrington Foundation," she announced, reading from the card that had accompanied the delivery. "For the musical education of the children at Oakwood, with special attention to nurturing exceptional talent." All eyes turned to Olivia, who stood frozen at the edge of the crowd. Her heart hammered in her chest as she stared at the instrument. It was easily worth more than everything else in the building combined. "Can I?" Her voice caught. She cleared her throat and tried again. "Can I try it?" Mrs. Wilson nodded, her eyes suspiciously bright. "Of course, dear. It was sent for you to use after all." The crowd parted as Olivia approached the piano. She circled it once, taking in every detail. The perfectly aligned keys, the smooth brass pedals, the maker's name engraved on the fallboard, Steinway & Sons. She'd only seen such instruments in pictures and videos online. With trembling fingers, she lifted the fallboard and revealed the keys, gleaming white and black, perfectly balanced and even. She sat on the bench, which adjusted to her height with a smooth mechanism, and placed her hands in position. The first chord she played resonated through the room with such clarity and richness that several of the younger children jumped. Olivia herself caught her breath. The sound was nothing like the tired upright she was used to. This was a voice, warm and alive and responsive to her lightest touch. For the next few minutes, she lost herself in exploring the instrument, testing its range and voice, feeling how the keys responded to different pressures. She didn't play anything in particular, just scales and fragments of melodies, getting acquainted with this magnificent new presence in her life. When she finally remembered where she was and looked up, she found the room had emptied except for Mrs. Wilson, who sat in a chair nearby with a contented smile. "They left to give you space," the director explained, "though I suspect they'll be back once they've processed the excitement." She leaned forward. "There's more, Olivia." "More?" Olivia couldn't imagine what could be more than this beautiful piano. Mrs. Wilson held up an envelope. "This came with the piano. Mr. Harrington's assistant called this morning to explain." She paused, seeming to choose her words carefully. "The Harrington Foundation is offering you a music scholarship. Full piano lessons twice weekly with Professor Lee from the conservatory, music theory classes, and participation in the Foundation's Young Musicians program." Olivia's hands fell from the keys to her lap. "Me? But why?" "Because you have a gift," Mrs. Wilson said simply. "A gift that deserves nurturing." "But—" Olivia's mind raced with questions. "What about what he said? About adoption?" Mrs. Wilson's expression softened. "That was just a figure of speech, dear. This is much more practical, and truthfully much more helpful to you right now. An adoption would take months or years of legal processes, and Mr. Harrington has no experience as a parent. This way you get the support you need for your talent while remaining in a stable environment." Olivia nodded slowly, pushing down the tiny flicker of disappointment. Mrs. Wilson was right. This was already more than she could have hoped for. A beautiful piano, real lessons with a professional teacher, a chance to develop her talent. It was a dream come true. When do I start? She asked. Professor Lee will come tomorrow after the piano tuner. The foundation has already sent music books and materials. They're in my office. Mrs. Wilson hesitated. There's one more thing. Mr. Harrington would like to attend your first lesson if that's all right with you. Olivia's pulse quickened. He's coming back? Yes, I believe he wants to see the results of his generosity. Mrs. Wilson stood, straightening her cardigan. You should practice something special to show him. After dinner, when the other children were watching TV in the recreation room, Olivia returned to the piano. She sat for a long moment without playing, just absorbing the reality of what had happened. Then slowly she began to play, not Chopin this time, but one of her own compositions. A simple melody that had been taking shape in her mind since Mr. Harrington's visit. She worked on it for hours, refining passages and adding harmonies, losing all track of time until Mrs. Wilson gently reminded her that it was past bedtime. Even then she continued composing in her head as she lay in bed, imagining how the piece would sound when it was finished. The next morning, the piano tuner arrived promptly at 9. Olivia watched, fascinated as he worked, explaining each adjustment he made to the strings and hammers. By the time he finished, the piano sounded even more magnificent, perfectly in tune, each note distinct yet part of a harmonious whole. At precisely 2 o'clock, a stern-looking woman in her 60s arrived carrying a leather briefcase. Professor Lee introduced herself with a firm handshake and immediately asked to hear Olivia play to assess what we're working with. Olivia had just seated herself at the piano when the main door opened again, and Richard Harrington walked in. He was dressed more casually than on his previous visit, in dark jeans and a simple sweater, his hair slightly tousled as if he'd been running his hands through it. He nodded to Mrs. Wilson and Professor Lee, then took a seat at the back of the room, gesturing for Olivia to continue as if he weren't there. But his presence changed everything. The air in the room seemed to crackle with tension and possibility. Professor Lee cleared her throat. Please begin with a scale. C major, both hands, 4 octaves. Olivia complied, her fingers moving smoothly across the keys. The professor nodded approvingly and requested several more scales, then arpeggios, testing Olivia's technique and ear. Now, please play something you've prepared, Professor Lee said, something that showcases your current abilities. Olivia took a deep breath. She could play Chopin again. That had impressed Mr. Harrington before, or Bach to show her technical skill. But instead, she began the piece she had worked on the night before, her own composition, still rough in places but deeply personal. The melody was simple at first, like a question being asked. Then it developed, growing more complex as different emotions entered, hope and uncertainty, joy and longing. She had named it after the rain in her mind, inspired by that night when she'd lain awake listening to the raindrops. When she finished, she kept her eyes on the keys, afraid to look up. The room was silent for several heartbeats. You composed that? Professor Lee asked finally, her voice revealing a new note of respect. Olivia nodded. It's unpolished, of course. The middle section needs development and the left-hand part is sometimes too predictable. But there's genuine musicality there. The professor made a note in her book. We'll work on theory and technique first, but we'll save time for composition as well. Only then did Olivia dare to glance at Mr. Harrington. He was leaning forward in his chair, watching her with an intensity that made her both nervous and strangely confident. When their eyes met, he smiled. Not the broad, somewhat artificial smile from his first visit, but something quieter and more genuine. Thank you for the piano, Olivia said softly. It's the most beautiful thing I've ever played. It was my sister's, he replied, his voice equally quiet. It's been in storage for 15 years. I think she would be pleased to know it's being played again, especially by someone with your talent. Before Olivia could respond, Professor Lee tapped her pencil against her notebook. We have much work to do. Mr. Harrington, will you be observing the entire lesson? If that's acceptable, he said, looking to Olivia for permission. She nodded, surprised by how much she wanted him to stay. There was something about his presence that felt encouraging, rather than intimidating, as if he truly cared about her progress. As the lesson began in earnest, Olivia realized that something fundamental had shifted in her life. The path ahead was still uncertain. She was still an orphan at Oakwood, still faced an unknown future. But for the first time in years, that path contained real possibilities. Doors opening rather than closing, and somewhere deep inside, a tiny seed of hope had taken root. Not the desperate wish for rescue that she'd abandoned long ago, but something more mature and realistic. A hope that perhaps in this unexpected way, she might have found not just a benefactor but someone who truly saw her. Spring turned to summer, and Olivia's life settled into a new rhythm. Twice a week, Professor Lee arrived at Oakwood for piano lessons, bringing with her increasingly challenging pieces and exercises. On Saturdays, a driver from the Harrington Foundation picked Olivia up to attend music theory and composition classes at the community music school downtown. The other children at Oakwood watched these developments with a mixture of envy and pride. Olivia had always been quiet, someone who existed on the periphery of their social circles. Now she had become something of a celebrity, the girl with the special piano and the famous benefactor. "What's he like?" Zoe, one of the younger girls, asked Olivia one evening as they prepared for bed. "Mr. Harrington, is he nice?" Olivia considered the question carefully. In the 3 months since her scholarship had begun, Richard Harrington had visited Oakwood at least once every 2 weeks. Sometimes he came to observe her lessons with Professor Lee, sitting quietly in the back of the room and leaving as soon as they finished. Other times he arrived unannounced on weekday evenings, pulling up in his sleek car just as dinner was ending. On those visits, he would ask Olivia to play whatever she was working on, listening with his eyes closed and his head slightly tilted. Afterward, they would talk, about music at first, then gradually about other things. He told her about growing up with his sister Catherine, who had shown remarkable musical talent before leukemia took her life at 16. Olivia shared memories of her parents and the apartment where they'd lived, filled with music and laughter until the accident. "He's complicated," Olivia finally answered Zoe. "Sometimes he seems sad, but yes, he's nice." What Olivia didn't say was how much she had come to look forward to those visits, or how, despite Mrs. Wilson's practical explanation that the scholarship was more valuable than any talk of adoption, she sometimes caught Mr. Harrington watching her with an expression that suggested he was considering something more permanent. One muggy afternoon in late July, Olivia was practicing a particularly difficult Beethoven sonata when Mrs. Wilson appeared at the door of the music room they had set up around the baby grand piano. "Olivia, could you come to my office? Mr. Harrington is here to speak with you." Something in the director's tone made Olivia's heart skip. She closed the piano carefully and followed Mrs. Wilson down the hallway, trying to read her expression for clues. Richard Harrington stood as they entered the office. He looked more formal than usual in a dark suit and tie, his posture slightly stiff. Beside him sat a woman Olivia had never seen before, dressed in a navy blue pantsuit with a folder on her lap. "Hello, Olivia," Mr. Harrington said, his voice carefully neutral. "This is Ms. Chen. No relation to you, just a coincidence. She's a family attorney who works with the foundation." Olivia nodded politely to the attorney, her mind racing. Why would Mr. Harrington bring a lawyer to meet her? "Please sit down," Mrs. Wilson said, gesturing to an empty chair. She took her seat behind the desk, folding her hands in front of her. Once Olivia was seated, Mr. Harrington cleared his throat. "Olivia, I've been thinking a lot about your situation here at Oakwood. You're receiving excellent musical education now, but there are limitations to what we can provide while you remain here." Olivia's mouth went dry. Was he ending the scholarship? Had she disappointed him somehow? "The Young Musicians program has a special opportunity coming up," he continued. "A 2-week intensive workshop at the National Conservatory, followed by a public concert. Professor Lee has recommended you for participation." "That sounds wonderful," Mrs. Wilson interjected. "When would this take place?" "Next month," Mr. Harrington replied. "But there's a complication. The program requires parental or guardian consent for minors, and it includes overnight stays at the conservatory dormitories." The attorney, Ms. Chen, spoke up. As a ward of the state currently placed at Oakwood, Olivia's legal guardian is technically the Department of Children's Services. Getting permission for something like this can be bureaucratically challenging. Olivia's heart sank. She knew all too well how slowly the system moved. By the time permission came through, if it came through at all, the opportunity would likely be gone. However, Mr. Harrington said, leaning forward slightly, there's another option we'd like to discuss. He glanced at the attorney, who nodded encouragingly. I've been speaking with Ms. Chen about the possibility of becoming your legal guardian. The words hung in the air. Olivia felt as if the room had suddenly tilted. Not adoption, he clarified quickly, perhaps seeing the shock on her face. Not yet, anyway. Legal guardianship is a different process, less permanent, more focused on making decisions about your education and welfare while you remain a minor. It would allow Mr. Harrington to make decisions regarding your participation in music programs, Ms. Chen explained. It would also permit you to occasionally stay at his residence when attending events in the city, rather than having to travel back and forth to Oakwood. Olivia looked at Mrs. Wilson, who smiled reassuringly. It's a generous offer, Olivia, and potentially very beneficial for your musical development. Would I still live at Oakwood? Olivia asked, trying to process what she was hearing. Mr. Harrington nodded. For now, yes. This arrangement would give us all time to adjust, to see if a more permanent solution might make sense in the future. He paused. I want to be completely honest with you, Olivia. When I made that thoughtless comment about adoption during my first visit, I had no idea how your playing would affect me, or how much I would come to. He trailed off, seemingly struggling for words. Care about you, Ms. Chen supplied quietly. Yes. He met Olivia's eyes directly. I've never been a parent. I'm not sure I'd be very good at it, but I do want to help you develop your talent. And I think we've formed a connection over these past months, a connection I'd like to explore further, in a way that's comfortable and safe for both of us. Olivia sat very still, afraid that if she moved or spoke, she might wake up and find this was all a dream. For years, she had protected herself from hope, from the possibility of finding a family again. The piano scholarship had been wonderful enough, a chance to develop her music without the emotional risk of attachment. But now, facing the possibility of something more, she found herself wanting it with an intensity that frightened her. You don't have to decide right now, Mrs. Wilson said gently. This is a big change to consider. Olivia took a deep breath. What if it doesn't work out? What if you change your mind? The questions were directed at Mr. Harrington, her voice barely above a whisper. He didn't answer immediately, and she appreciated that. It meant he was taking her fears seriously, not dismissing them with easy reassurances. I can't promise perfection, he said finally, but I can promise commitment. I wouldn't suggest this if I weren't prepared to follow through. He hesitated, then added, My sister used to say that the most beautiful music comes from taking risks, from being willing to play the difficult passages, even when you might hit a wrong note. Despite her nervousness, Olivia smiled at that. Professor Lee says the same thing. Smart woman, Professor Lee. Mr. Harrington returned the smile, some of the tension leaving his shoulders. So what do you think? Would you be willing to try this arrangement, to see where it leads? Olivia looked around the room, at Mrs. Wilson's encouraging face, at Ms. Chen's professional but kind expression, at Mr. Harrington's hopeful eyes. For the first time in 6 years, she allowed herself to imagine a different future, one with a home that wasn't shared with dozens of other children, with someone who truly understood her passion for music, with the possibility of family again. I think, she said slowly, I'd like to try. The next few weeks passed in a whirlwind of activity. There were forms to fill out, interviews with social workers, home inspections of Mr. Harrington's penthouse apartment, and meetings with a judge. Through it all, Olivia continued her lessons with Professor Lee, finding refuge in music whenever the process became overwhelming. Mr. Harrington proved surprisingly patient with the bureaucracy, never showing frustration when additional documentation was requested or deadlines were extended. It's worth it, he told Olivia when she apologized for the complications. You're worth it. By the time August arrived, the temporary guardianship had been approved. Olivia was officially registered for the National Conservatory workshop, with Mr. Harrington legally authorized to sign all the necessary permission forms. The night before she was to leave for the workshop, Olivia sat at her piano at Oakwood, playing softly in the empty main hall. She had chosen to stay at the children's home until after the workshop, agreeing with Mr. Harrington that they should take this new arrangement one step at a time. She was playing her own composition, the one she had first performed for him and Professor Lee, now greatly improved through months of instruction. She'd titled it After the Rain and had secretly dedicated it to her parents and to Catherine, Mr. Harrington's sister, people loved and lost, whose music lived on through those who remembered them. As the final notes faded, she heard soft applause from the doorway. Mrs. Wilson stood there, a gentle smile on her face. That was beautiful, the director said, coming to sit beside Olivia on the piano bench. You've grown so much as a musician these past months. Thanks to Mr. Harrington, Olivia said. Thanks to your own hard work and talent, Mrs. Wilson corrected. Mr. Harrington simply provided the opportunity. She paused. Are you nervous about tomorrow? A little, Olivia admitted. Not about the workshop, but about everything else. What if I'm not what he's looking for in a... She stopped, not sure what word to use. In a daughter, Mrs. Wilson supplied gently. Olivia nodded, her throat tight. Oh, my dear. Mrs. Wilson put an arm around her shoulders. You don't have to be anything but yourself. That's who he's come to care for, just Olivia, with all your quiet strength and remarkable talent. As Olivia leaned against the older woman who had been the closest thing to a mother she'd had for 6 years, she realized that whatever happened next, she was no longer alone. She had Mrs. Wilson in Oakwood. She had Professor Lee in her music. And now she had Mr. Harrington and a chance, just a chance, at having a family again. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities. But tonight, for the first time in years, Olivia Chen allowed herself to fully embrace hope. 2 years later, on a crisp autumn morning, Olivia Chen stood before the full-length mirror in what was now her bedroom in Richard Harrington's penthouse apartment. At 14, she had grown taller, her face losing some of its childish roundness. Her dark hair, once always pulled back in a practical ponytail, now fell in soft waves past her shoulders. But the biggest change wasn't in her appearance, it was in her eyes. The wariness that had been her constant companion at Oakwood had been replaced by a quiet confidence. She smoothed the front of her navy blue dress, a new purchase for today's special occasion, and took a deep breath. Behind her, reflected in the mirror, was the white baby grand piano that now occupied one corner of her room. It wasn't Catherine's piano. That one remained in the main living area of the apartment. This smaller instrument had been a gift on her 14th birthday, 6 months earlier. Your own piano for your own compositions, Richard had said when she'd unwrapped the comically large red bow he'd placed on it. A gentle knock on her door pulled Olivia from her thoughts. Come in, she called. Richard entered, dressed more formally than usual in a charcoal suit and deep blue tie. He stopped when he saw her, his expression softening into a smile. You look beautiful, he said. Ready for the big day? Olivia nodded, though her stomach fluttered with nervous excitement. I think so. Is everyone here? Almost. Mrs. Wilson just texted that the Oakwood van is parking now. Professor Lee arrived a few minutes ago and is already rearranging the furniture to her liking. He chuckled, then grew more serious. How are you feeling, really? Over the past 2 years, they had developed a practice of complete honesty with each other. It hadn't always been easy. Both of them tended toward privacy, toward keeping their deeper emotions hidden. But they had learned that truth. Even when uncomfortable was the foundation of trust. Nervous, Olivia admitted. Happy. A little sad, too. Richard nodded, understanding without her having to explain. Today was a day of joy, but it also marked a formal goodbye to the possibility that her birth parents might somehow return, a childish fantasy she had long outgrown, but whose final release still brought a pang of grief. That's all normal, he said, and for what it's worth, I'm nervous too. He glanced at his watch. We should head downstairs. The car will be here in 20 minutes. As they walked together through the spacious apartment, Olivia reflected on the journey that had brought them here. After the National Conservatory workshop 2 years ago, she had begun spending weekends at Richard's apartment, returning to Oakwood during the week. Gradually, those weekends had extended to include school holidays and summer breaks. 6 months ago, after long discussions with social workers, therapists, and Mrs. Wilson, Richard had formally begun the adoption process. Today, they would appear before a judge to finalize what they already knew in their hearts, that they had become a family. The living room was filled with people when they descended the stairs. Professor Lee, elegant as always in a crimson pantsuit, was deep in conversation with Ms. Chen, the attorney who had handled all the legal aspects of first the guardianship and now the adoption. Mrs. Wilson stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, admiring the view of the city park below, while several of the staff from Oakwood arranged gift bags on a side table. A small cheer went up when Olivia and Richard entered the room. Mrs. Wilson hurried over to embrace Olivia. "Look at you," she said, holding Olivia at arm's length to admire her dress. "All grown up and beautiful." "Hardly grown up," Olivia protested with a laugh. "I'm only 14, going on 30 in maturity," Richard added with a proud smile. "You should see her negotiating her curfew. I feel like I'm facing a corporate lawyer." Everyone laughed and the slight tension in the room dissolved. As Richard moved away to greet Professor Lee, Mrs. Wilson leaned closer to Olivia. "I brought something for you," she said in a low voice. "A little pre-adoption gift." She pressed a small velvet box into Olivia's hand. "Open it later when you have a private moment." Before Olivia could thank her, the apartment buzzer sounded, announcing the arrival of their transportation. Richard clapped his hands once to get everyone's attention. "The cars are here, everyone. Shall we head to the courthouse?" The next hour passed in a blur of activity. The drive through city streets, the walk through the imposing courthouse, the waiting in a wood-paneled anteroom. Richard remained close to Olivia's side throughout, his steady presence a comfort as her nerves intensified. Finally, they were ushered into a judge's chambers. Judge Rivera, a kind-faced woman with silver-streaked hair, greeted them warmly. "I've reviewed all the documentation in your case," she said, gesturing for everyone to be seated. "Everything appears to be in perfect order. But before I make my final ruling, I'd like to speak with Olivia privately for a few moments." Richard squeezed Olivia's hand reassuringly, then joined the others in stepping outside. When the door closed, the judge came around her desk to sit in the chair beside Olivia. "No need to be nervous," she said gently. "I just want to make sure you understand what's happening today and that this is truly what you want." Olivia nodded. "It is, more than anything. Tell me about your relationship with Mr. Harrington," the judge prompted. "How has it developed over these 2 years?" Olivia thought for a moment, wanting to express herself clearly. "At first it was all about music. He gave me the chance to develop my talent, and I was grateful for that. But then we started to know each other as people. He told me about his sister Catherine, and how losing her affected him. I shared memories of my parents." She paused, then continued. "He's not perfect. Sometimes he works too much, and he can be impatient when things don't go as planned. But he always apologizes when he's wrong, and he really listens when I talk. He comes to every recital and competition, even when he has important meetings, and he never makes me feel like I have to earn his love through my music." Judge Rivera nodded encouragingly. "And what about difficult moments? Have you had disagreements?" Olivia smiled slightly. "Plenty. Especially when I started public school last year after being homeschooled at Oakwood. We argued about everything from homework schedules to whether I could join the jazz band when I was already so busy with classical training." "And how did you resolve those conflicts?" "By talking. Sometimes with help from Dr. Palmer. She's the family therapist we see once a month. Richard says that good communication is like good music. It takes practice and sometimes professional instruction." The judge smiled at that. "He sounds wise. One last question, Olivia. When you imagine your future, what do you see?" Olivia didn't hesitate. "Music, of course. I want to perform and compose. But also family. Richard as my dad, holidays together, ordinary days. And I want to help other kids from Oakwood find their paths too. We've started a foundation to provide arts education to foster children." Judge Rivera studied her for a long moment, then nodded, apparently satisfied with what she saw. "Thank you, Olivia. I'd like to invite everyone back in now." When the others had returned and settled into their seats, the judge resumed her place behind her desk. "Having reviewed all relevant documentation and spoken with both parties, I find that this adoption is in the best interest of the child. Richard Harrington has demonstrated consistent commitment to Olivia's welfare over a significant period, and Olivia has expressed her full and informed consent to the adoption." She picked up her pen and signed the document before her with a flourish. "By the power vested in me by the state, I hereby declare Olivia Chen to be the legal daughter of Richard Harrington, with all the rights and responsibilities thereof." She smiled at them both. "Congratulations to your family." The small gathering broke into applause. Richard turned to Olivia, his eyes suspiciously bright. "May I hug you, Miss Harrington Chen?" he asked formally, using the hyphenated surname they had agreed upon, honoring both her past and her future. "You may, Dad," she replied, using the title that until now had felt too presumptuous, too fragile with hope. Their embrace was interrupted by Mrs. Wilson, who was already organizing everyone for photos. "Come on, you two. This is a moment to remember." Later that afternoon, after a celebratory lunch at Olivia's favorite restaurant, they returned to the apartment. Their guests had departed, promising to return for the larger reception planned for the weekend. Richard had a conference call he couldn't reschedule, so Olivia retreated to her room for a moment of quiet reflection. Sitting on the edge of her bed, she remembered the small velvet box Mrs. Wilson had given her. She opened it carefully to find a delicate silver locket inside, not her mother's, which she still kept in her jewelry box, but similar in design. When she pressed the tiny clasp, it opened to reveal a photograph she had never seen before, her parents on their wedding day, smiling with their whole hearts. On the opposite side was a small note in Mrs. Wilson's neat handwriting. "Your past and future, both filled with love." Olivia closed the locket and slipped it around her neck. Then she moved to her piano and began to play. Not a classical piece or even one of her own compositions, but a simple improvisation that expressed what words could not. Gratitude for what had been lost and found, for the unexpected ways that life could heal even the deepest wounds. In the doorway, Richard appeared, his conference call finished. He leaned against the frame, listening without interrupting. When Olivia finally looked up and saw him, she smiled. "I was thinking about that day you first came to Oakwood," she said, "when you made that joke about adoption if I played the piano." Richard winced slightly. "Not my finest moment. Mrs. Wilson scolded me thoroughly for it later." "Did she?" Olivia laughed. "She never told me that." "Oh, yes. Said I had no business giving a child false hope." He crossed the room to sit beside her on the piano bench. She was right, of course. I spoke without thinking, and yet here we are. Olivia gestured around them, at the room that was now truly hers, at the piano that represented not just music but belonging, at the family photographs already displayed on her dresser, including one taken just hours ago at the courthouse. "Here we are," Richard agreed softly, "though I think we both know it wasn't that simple. It wasn't just one moment or one piece of music. It was all the moments after, all the conversations and lessons and ordinary days that brought us to this point." Olivia nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. The path that had led them here hadn't been straight or easy. There had been setbacks and missteps, doubts and fears on both sides. But there had also been patience and persistence, honesty and growth. "Play something with me?" Richard asked. Though not as talented as his sister had been, he had started taking piano lessons himself over the past year. "So I can understand your world better," he'd explained. Olivia shifted to make room for him on the bench, then placed her hands on the keys for a simple duet they had been practicing. As they played together, their music filling the room with harmony, she thought about all the ways that life could surprise you, how a careless comment could lead to a careful commitment, how loss could give way to discovery, how family could be found in the most unexpected places. And she knew, with a certainty that resonated as clearly as the notes they played, that this was only the beginning of their story.